Gary didn't even look up from his hot dog. He just wiped mustard off his lip and said, "By the way, Gabriella is taking the lower unit next week. She needs a content studio." He didn't ask. He announced it. Across the picnic table, my sister Gabriella just sipped her seltzer, watching me, waiting for the explosion. But I didn't explode. I didn't even blink. I pulled out my phone, checked my calendar, and smiled the coldest smile of my life. "Tuesday sounds doable," I said. And just like that, they walked right into the trap. Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. And tell me, have you ever had a family member volunteer your property like it was theirs? I read every single one. Most people would have flipped the table. They would have thrown the potato salad, screamed at their father, and told their sister to get a job. But I didn't. I sat there watching the heat shimmer off the charcoal grill, feeling the sweat trickle down my back, and I just nodded. To an outsider, my silence looked like submission. It looked like Brianna, the 32-year-old doormat, was rolling over yet again for the family that treated her like a spare part. But that is because outsiders don't understand the mechanics of survival in a house like mine. There is a psychological concept I learned years ago, but I lived it long before I could name it. It is called the invisible chain of the survivor. When you grow up as the responsible one in a family of chaotic narcissists, you learn early that resistance is expensive. Fighting back costs you sleep, it costs you peace, and it costs you your sanity. So you forge a chain. Link by link, you learn to say okay when you want to scream no. You learn to fix the mess you didn't make because it is faster than arguing about who broke the glass. You learn to pay the bill because the emotional interest rate of asking them to pay is too high. Compliance wasn't my weakness. It was my camouflage. For 3 decades, I had been the gray rock, the steady paycheck. The solar project manager who worked 60-hour weeks to afford a down payment in Denver's Rhino district, while my 27-year-old sister, Gabriella, spent her days curating her aesthetic on Instagram. I looked at Gabriella across the picnic table. She was picking at a bun, bored, scrolling on her phone. She didn't even look grateful. Why would she? To her, this wasn't a gift. It was an expectation. Our parents, Gary and Catherine, had been subsidizing her lifestyle for a decade. They paid her credit card bill every month, $3,000 of brunch clothes and trips to Tulum, while their own finances quietly rotted from the inside out. They treated money like magic, and I was the magician who was supposed to keep the illusion alive. But this time was different. This wasn't a borrowed car or a loan for rent. This was my asset, my duplex. I had scraped and saved and sacrificed every luxury for 5 years to buy this property. The plan was simple. I would live in the upper unit and the rental income from the lower unit would cover the mortgage. It was my exit strategy. It was my freedom. And Gary had just offered it up as a free playground for his golden child. "She needs the space for her brand," Mom chirped, pouring more iced tea. "The lighting in her current place is terrible. Plus, it keeps the equity in the family," Dad added, as if he had contributed a single cent to the down payment. I looked at them, really looked at them, and I felt the chains snap. Not with a bang, but with a quiet metallic click. They thought I was silent because I was agreeing. I wasn't. I was calculating. I was realizing that my family wasn't a support system. They were a liability. And just like any bad investment, it was time to cut my losses. I took a sip of my lukewarm lemonade. I let the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable, but not long enough to be suspicious. I needed time. I needed business hours. I needed a lease signed and a deposit cleared before they showed up with their moving van. "Tuesday sounds doable," I said. They smiled, relieved that the ATM was still dispensing cash. They didn't know that for the first time in my life, I wasn't writing a check. I was writing an eviction notice. I left the barbecue 20 minutes later, claiming a migraine. It was the only excuse they ever respected because it meant I was suffering, and suffering was my role. As I walked to my car, I could hear Gabriella laughing, already planning which wall she would knock down for better lighting. I didn't look back. Tears are a waste of hydration in a drought, and I was done being thirsty. I didn't even slam the car door. I drove straight to a coffee shop 3 miles away, opened my laptop, and went to work. This wasn't an emotional reaction. It was a business transaction. I logged into a private forum for legal professionals in Denver, a group I had access to through my work in solar contracts. I posted a listing: immediate occupancy, lower unit duplex in Reno, luxury finishes, market rate, move-in must happen within 48 hours. I knew exactly who I was looking for. I didn't want a college student or a family. I wanted a professional who needed speed and discretion. Within 10 minutes, my inbox pinged. "Can meet in 30 minutes. Cash ready. Need place immediately." The name was Grace. We met at the coffee shop. Grace didn't look like someone who was desperate, but she had the tight, controlled expression of a woman who was managing a crisis. She was sharp-dressed in a blazer that cost more than my car payment, and she didn't waste time on small talk. She explained she was going through a sudden, volatile breakup and needed a secure place where her ex couldn't find her. She needed it today. "I can do today," I said, sliding the lease across the table. "But I have one condition. The locks get changed immediately, and the code is yours alone. No one else has access, not even my family." Grace looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw a flicker of recognition. She knew what it was like to need boundaries that were made of steel. "Done," she said. She pulled out a checkbook and wrote a certified check for $7,200, first, last, and deposit. The pen scratched against the paper, a sound that felt more satisfying than any scream I had ever suppressed. It was the sound of autonomy. It was the sound of my asset finally working for me instead of being drained by the people who claimed to love me. We drove to the duplex separately. I watched as Grace walked through the lower unit, her heels clicking on the polished concrete floors. She didn't critique the paint or complain about the view. She looked around and exhaled a long, shuddering breath of relief. "It's perfect," she said. I handed her the keys and walked her to the keypad. "The code is changed," I told her. "It's active now. You are the legal tenant of this property. If anyone tries to tell you otherwise, you call me." Grace nodded, her eyes hardening. "I can handle myself," she said. I had a feeling she could. I drove back to my own apartment, the check burning a hole in my bag. I didn't deposit it yet. I wanted to hold on to it for a little while longer. It was physical proof that I wasn't crazy, that my property had value, and that I had the right to control it. The sun was setting over the Rockies, casting long shadows across the city, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel the darkness creeping in. I felt lighter. The trap was armed. The bait was set. And on Tuesday, the jaws were going to snap shut. Tuesday morning arrived with the heavy electric feeling of a storm about to break. I went to work at the solar site, just like any other day, checking installation schedules and reviewing contracts, but my phone sat on my desk face up like a live grenade. I knew exactly how the day would unfold for them. Gabriella would sleep until 11. Mom would bring her coffee. They would load up Dad's truck with her velvet armchair, her ring lights, her boxes of beige decor. They would drive to the duplex giddy with entitlement, already planning where to put the espresso machine I hadn't bought. At 1:45 p.m., my phone lit up. First, it was a text from Gabriella. "Code isn't working. Did you change it?" Then 2 minutes later, "Seriously, Brianna, it's hot out here. Pick up." Then the call. "Mom." I let it ring 3 times before answering. I kept my voice calm, professional, detached. "Hello?" Brianna, her voice was shrill, vibrating with panic. "What is going on? We are at the duplex. The code is wrong and there are shoes outside the door. Someone is inside." "Yes," I said, leaning back in my office chair. That would be the tenant. The silence on the other end was deafening. It was the sound of a reality they had never considered crashing into their fantasy world. "What?" Mom sputtered. "The tenant. Grace. She signed a lease on Saturday. She moved in yesterday." But Gabriella is here," Mom's voice rose to a shriek. "We have the truck. She gave up her apartment. Where is she supposed to go?" "I don't know," I said. "Maybe she should have signed a lease." I heard a scuffle, and then Dad's voice boomed through the speaker. "Brianna, you listen to me. You get down here right now and fix this. You tell that person to leave. This is your sister's studio." "I can't do that, Dad. It's a legal contract." "It's signed." The check cleared. "I don't care about a contract," he roared. "We discussed this at the barbecue." And there it was. The moment I had been waiting for. The moment I could finally say the words that had been building inside me for a lifetime. "Dad," I said, my voice ice cold. I chose to honor a signed legal contract over a conversation we had over potato salad. I hung up. My hand was shaking just a little as I set the phone down. But the silence didn't last. Within seconds, the notifications started. Text after text. Calls from Gabriella. Calls from Dad. Then the social media notifications began. Gabriella had gone live on Instagram. I watched it in horror and fascination. She was sitting in the front seat of Dad's truck, tears streaming down her face, the perfect picture of a victim. "My own sister," she sobbed to her 6,000 followers. "She promised me this place. She knew I had nowhere to go. And she rented it out from under me just to be cruel. I'm literally homeless right now because of her." It was a performance. A master class in manipulation. But as I watched her cry, I didn't feel the old urge to fix it. I didn't feel the need to rush in and save her. I felt something new. I felt the cold, hard resolve of someone who was finally done being the villain in a story they didn't write. The war had started, and they had no idea who they were fighting. That evening, the storm finally made landfall. I was in my apartment trying to answer emails when I heard the pounding. It wasn't a knock, it was a demand. I looked out the window and saw my parents' SUV parked crookedly in front of the duplex. Dad was hammering on the door of the lower unit, and Mom was pacing behind him, phone to her ear, probably leaving me another hysterical voicemail. I didn't run down there. I didn't call the police. I just watched. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew who was behind that door. Dad shouted something about squatters and family property. He was blustering, using the same volume and intimidation tactics that had worked on me for 30 years. He thought he was dealing with some random girl I had found on Craigslist. He thought he could bully her into packing a bag and leaving. The door opened. Grace didn't look intimidated. She looked annoyed. She was still wearing her blazer, holding a cup of tea, and she leaned against the doorframe with a calmness that was almost terrifying. I couldn't hear every word through the glass, but I saw the body language shift. Dad pointed a finger in her face. Grace didn't flinch. She just watched him unimpressed, like he was a toddler having a tantrum in a grocery store. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small white card. She handed it to him. Dad looked at it. He froze. Mom leaned over to read it, and her hand flew to her mouth. Grace said something, then something short and sharp. I saw Dad take a step back. Then another. The man who had ruled our family with his volume and his anger was suddenly retreating. Later, Grace texted me the details. "Your father threatened to throw my things on the street," she wrote. "I informed him that under Colorado Revised Statute 3812-509, illegal eviction is a serious offense. I also let him know that as a tenants' rights attorney, I would be happy to file for maximum damages plus emotional distress plus legal fees. I quoted him the exact dollar amount he would owe me by tomorrow morning if he touched a single box. I think he understood." I stared at the text, a laugh bubbling up in my chest that felt like champagne. They had walked into a minefield. They had tried to use their old weapons intimidation volume entitlement against someone who held the nuclear codes. Legal paralysis. That was what it looked like. They couldn't kick her out. They couldn't move Gabriella in. They couldn't even yell at her without risking a lawsuit that would bankrupt them. I watched them get back into their SUV. Dad slammed the door so hard the car shook. They drove away, defeated not by me, but by the law. The trap had snapped shut, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one bleeding. The silence following their retreat lasted exactly 48 hours. It was the calm before the psychological storm. I knew they wouldn't come back to the duplex. Grace had scared them too badly for that, but I also knew that people like Gary and Catherine do not accept defeat. They just change weapons. On Thursday morning, the notification pinged on my laptop. It wasn't a text or a voicemail. It was an email with the subject line, "Official Notice Regarding Family Estate." It was marked high priority. I opened it, sipping my coffee, expecting a rage-filled rant. Instead, I found a document that tried desperately to sound like a legal decree. It was written in a stiff, formal font full of phrases like "hereby" and "forthwith." "Brianna," it read, "due to your recent actions, specifically the theft of family property and the malicious treatment of your sister, we have made the difficult decision to remove you from the Henderson Family Trust and Will. Effective immediately, you are disinherited. You will receive no portion of the estate, no family heirlooms, and no financial support. You have chosen money over blood, so you shall have neither." I read it twice, and then I started laughing. Not a bitter laugh, but a genuine, belly-shaking laugh of disbelief. This moment was the perfect crystallization of what I call the delusion of power of the empty wallet. It is a specific kind of madness that infects parents who have tied their entire identity to a financial status they lost decades ago. My parents were posturing like monarchs, threatening to exile a traitor from the kingdom, completely ignoring the fact that the castle had burned down years ago. They were threatening to cut me off from the family legacy. But I was the one who managed their paperwork. I was the one who had helped them refinance 3 times. I knew the numbers better than they did. There was no estate. There was no trust. I opened a separate folder on my laptop labeled Parental Liabilities. I looked at the spreadsheet I had updated 6 months ago when Dad asked for a bridge loan. Gary had a second mortgage on their house that was underwater by $40,000. Catherine had 6 credit cards maxed out to the limit, totaling $35,000 in high-interest consumer debt. Their investments were a series of failed timeshares and a boat that hadn't run since 2015. The legacy they were threatening to withhold from me wasn't wealth. It was a negative number. It was $150,000 of bad decisions and keeping up appearances. They were trying to control me with a phantom limb. They believed that because they were the parents, they held the power of provision, even though I had been the one providing for them for years. They were threatening to starve me, not realizing I was the one buying the groceries. I looked at that email, at the bold underlined text declaring my exile, and I felt a profound sense of pity. It was pathetic. It was the last gasp of two people who had nothing left to offer but the absence of a burden. I didn't reply. I didn't argue that you can't disinherit someone from debt. I simply dragged the email into a folder labeled Evidence and closed the laptop. They thought they had just played their trump card. They didn't realize they had just set me free. If the price of my freedom was losing a share of their bankruptcy, then I had just gotten the bargain of a lifetime. Gabriella's counterattack launched at noon on Friday. It was a 3-part video series titled The Betrayal, and I had to admit the production value was high. She had ring lighting, a perfectly messy bun, and tears that fell right on the beat. She told her 12,000 followers that I had lured her into giving up her lease, promised her a studio to help her launch her dream, and then pulled the rug out at the last minute because I was jealous of her creative freedom. She called me a corporate drone who hated seeing her shine. She painted a picture of me as a bitter spinster, hoarding wealth while she slept on a friend's couch. I watched it once. I didn't feel angry. I felt like an auditor reviewing a fraudulent tax return. She had made a critical error. She had brought a story to a data fight. I opened the folder on my laptop that I had been compiling for years. I called it the ledger. It wasn't emotional. It was forensic. I didn't write a long defensive rant. I simply created a carousel post. Slide 1, a high-resolution photo of the property deed. It showed one name, Brianna Henderson. It showed the date of purchase 5 years ago. It showed the co-signers, none. Slide 2, screenshots of the text thread from the 4th of July. Dad's demand, Gabriella, is taking the lower unit next week. My single response Tuesday sounds doable. No promise, no agreement. Just a date acknowledging their invasion. Slide 3, the financial breakdown. I had created a simple pie chart. Total financial support given to family over 10 years, $82,000. Total financial support received from family, $0. Current parental consumer debt load, $150,000. I didn't write a paragraph about my feelings. I wrote one sentence for the caption, receipts for the eviction of the entitlement narrative. Then I did the thing that made it lethal. I tagged the 3 skincare brands Gabriella was actively trying to court for sponsorships. I tagged the boutique hotel she was trying to get a free stay from. I hit post. It took 12 minutes for the tide to turn. The internet loves a victim, but it loves justice more. The comments shifted from, "Your sister is toxic," to "Show us the deed." Strangers started dissecting her lies. The brands responded publicly within the hour, thanking me for bringing this concerning information to their attention. They didn't want to associate with a liability. Gabriella deleted her account at 4 p.m. The nuclear option doesn't leave survivors. It just leaves silence. The silence that followed was absolute. The extinction burst had ended. My parents didn't call. They didn't text. They didn't send flying monkeys to my door. They retreated into the shadows of their own embarrassment, finally realizing that I wasn't an audience they could perform for anymore. I wasn't a resource they could mine. I was a wall they had crashed into. I heard through a cousin that Gabriella is working as a barista at a chain coffee shop downtown. She shares a 3-bedroom apartment with 4 other people. She pays her own rent. It is the first honest money she has ever earned. Dad and Mom are reportedly looking to downsize, forced to face the math they tried to ignore for decades. I sat in my living room on Sunday evening. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the room in gold. My phone was quiet. Tyler walked in with takeout, and for the first time in my life, the air didn't feel heavy. The rent check from Grace cleared that morning. $2,400. It covered the mortgage with money to spare. My asset was finally an asset. I looked at the empty space where my obligation used to be. To anyone listening who feels like the villain for walking away, I need you to hear this. They call you cold because you stopped setting yourself on fire to keep them warm. They call you selfish because you stopped letting them consume you. They call you difficult because you finally became impossible to use. Cutting the tie isn't an act of war. It is an act of surgery. You are removing the dead weight so you can finally actually live. You are not abandoning them. You are saving yourself. The only thing you owe your family is the truth. And if the truth destroys them, then they were never built on solid ground to begin with. If you needed to hear that letter today, type "I choose me" in the comments. And if this story helped you find your spine, share it with someone who needs to find